The paramedic wants to play with the CEO's daughter. Look at his jacket. He's clearly not her world. That whispered insult was the last thing anyone at that Chicago Christmas gala expected to matter. But the 8-year-old deaf girl gripping the stranger's wrist wasn't just breaking her mother's world's unspoken rules. She was about to drag every secret in that ballroom out into the light. Before we see how far those secrets would go, let's rewind back to a cracked driveway in Berwyn, Illinois, where a single father named Arthur Kane still believed hard work and love were the only things a man needed. Arthur Kane was 37 years old, and he believed exactly one thing all the way down to his bones. If a man worked hard enough and loved his son with everything he had, life owed him nothing else. It didn't matter that his work boots were held together with duct tape at the toe, or that his checking account read $47 with 2 days left until payday. That belief was the floor he stood on every morning at 5:10 a.m. in a one-bedroom apartment on Wesley Avenue in Berwyn, Illinois. He did not know that in 6 hours, a room full of strangers in black-tie tuxedos would look at him with contempt, and that an 8-year-old girl who couldn't hear a single word of it would be the one to change everything. That December morning, Arthur was up before his alarm, the way he always was. Coffee first, black, in a chipped mug that said, "World's Okayest Fisherman." Then eggs for Miles, his 9-year-old, who ate standing at the counter because the school bus came at 7:40. The old minivan, Miles called it the Dragon on account of the way it groaned before it started, needed a jump twice that week already. Arthur kept a spare battery pack behind the driver's seat like other men kept a spare tire. He worked 2 jobs, days on the ambulance with Chicago Fire Department EMS, nights doing security shifts when the schedule allowed, because paramedic pay didn't stretch far enough for a growing boy, and a landlord who raised the rent every March. His neighbor, Miss Betty, 2 doors down, kept an eye on Miles on the nights Arthur worked late. And in exchange, Arthur fixed her porch swing. That night, December 23rd, Arthur wasn't at the Fairmont Chicago Hotel on Columbus Drive, because he belonged there. He was there as backup medical staff, standing near a folded table with a first aid kit, hired through an agency for the evening. The hotel ballroom had been turned into a Christmas gala. String lights strung floor to ceiling over Millennium Park, views a stage set up for speeches, and 300 guests in gowns and tuxedos, who'd paid a great deal of money to be seen supporting a children's charity. The charity belonged to Elena Vaughn, 35, CEO of a logistics company most of the guests in that room depended on for their own fortunes. She'd started the fund herself 7 years earlier, not long after Ava was first diagnosed as profoundly deaf. Though few in that room knew that, or that Elena had been raising Ava alone since her husband's death. She was up on the stage half the night, shaking hands, thanking donors, the kind of smile Arthur recognized from certain patients, the kind that cost something to hold. While she worked the room, her daughter sat alone. Ava Vaughn was 8 years old in a red velvet dress, her dark hair pulled back neat, and she was deaf. She sat in a corner chair near the towering Christmas tree, hands folded in her lap, watching 300 adults talk without ever once turning to look at her. Nobody signed to her. Nobody sat beside her. She had learned, apparently, to make herself very still and very small in rooms like this. Arthur noticed her the way he noticed everything on a shift, quietly and all at once. He walked over, knees popping as he crouched down to her eye level, and he did the only thing that felt right. He signed slow and careful, "Merry Christmas." Then he shaped his fingers into a small, lopsided star. Ava stared at him for a long moment. And then she smiled. A real one. The first genuine smile that ballroom had seen out of her all night. That's when it happened. A cluster of guests, nearby drinks in hand, laughed loud enough to carry. "Look at that," one of them said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "The paramedic wants to play with the CEO's daughter." One look at his jacket and you know he's not exactly her world. A few feet away, on the stage steps, a silver-haired board member named Grant Holloway leaned toward Elena and murmured something meant only for her. "I told security this afternoon, no outside personnel near Ava." How did he get through? Elena's eyes cut sharply toward the corner. And that's when Ava reached out and grabbed Arthur's wrist and would not let go. Phones came up, screens lit. A dozen guests turned their cameras toward the paramedic and the little girl who wouldn't release his hand. Elena stepped down off the stage, heels sharp against marble, her face unreadable. Somewhere behind the scenes, her PR director's phone buzzed with a message flashing red across the screen. The paramedic is already being live-streamed in the donor group chat. Nobody in that ballroom, not Arthur, not Elena, not even Grant Holloway, understood yet that this small, quiet moment by a Christmas tree was about to turn 3 families upside down. What happens in the next 60 seconds will decide whether Arthur Kane keeps his job. Stay with us, because it only gets harder from here. Elena crossed the ballroom floor fast. The kind of fast that looked calm, only because she'd had years of practice making urgency look like grace. She stopped in front of Arthur, thanked him in a voice pitched for the cameras still aimed their way, and reached for her daughter's hand. Ava didn't let go of Arthur's wrist. Instead, small fingers moving quick and certain, she signed something up at her mother, eyes never leaving Arthur's face. Elena's throat moved before her voice caught up. She translated it out loud, quiet, almost to herself. She says, "He looks at me different." Arthur felt that sentence land somewhere under his ribs. He started to step back. A man in an agency-rented medical vest didn't belong in a moment like this. But before he could retreat, Elena asked the question everyone around them was clearly thinking. "How do you know sign language?" Arthur answered plainly. "My sister was deaf. Since she was little, I learned before I learned much else." He nodded toward the first aid table. "This job, you'd be surprised how many patients can't hear you when it matters most." It wasn't a story about his own son. Miles, waiting at home with Miss Betty and a bowl of popcorn, could hear just fine. That detail seemed to catch Elena off guard, like she'd been bracing for a different kind of man. She didn't say much else. She thanked him again, gathered Ava, and walked back into the noise of the gala. But something in the way she'd looked at him, careful, assessing, unsettled, told Arthur this wasn't finished. That night, back on Wesley Avenue, Arthur sat out on Miss Betty's porch before heading inside. The swing creaked under him as always. Miss Betty rocked beside him with a mug of decaf and asked how the fancy party had gone. "Made a friend," Arthur said. 8 years old. Ate half a Christmas ham and never said a word to anybody except me. "Sounds like the two of you have the right idea," Miss Betty said. Inside, Miles was asleep on the couch, with the television still playing an old Western. Arthur carried him to bed. 3 days later, the day after Christmas, Arthur's phone rang while he was still in his EMS uniform, wiping down the back of the rig after a call. It was Elena. Her voice had none of the gala night polish left in it. "Ava's having a panic episode," she said. "She won't let anyone near her. Not the nanny, not me. She keeps signing your name, Starman. I don't know what else to do." Arthur didn't hesitate. He clocked out 20 minutes early, something he'd never done in 6 years on the job, and drove straight to the Gold Coast to a penthouse building, where the doorman eyed his EMS jacket the way people had at the gala. The penthouse smelled like fresh paint and lilies, the kind of place where nothing looked lived in. Ava was curled on the living room floor, rocking slightly, hands pressed over her ears. Even though sound wasn't what was hurting her, she'd lost her silver bracelet, an old, scuffed thing, not worth much to anyone but her, and she would not be consoled. Arthur knelt down at her eye level and signed slowly. "Where did you have it last?" It took 20 minutes of careful searching before he found it tucked inside the pocket of Elena's coat, where it must have slipped during a hug that morning. When he pressed it back into Ava's palm, her whole body seemed to deflate with relief. Then she signed something smaller, something not meant for the room, just for him. "Mom cries in the bathroom every night. She thinks I don't know." Arthur didn't tell Elena what her daughter had said. Some things weren't his to hand over. But he noticed on the coffee table a fundraising file left open, one line underlined twice in Elena's own handwriting. "Guests only show up for the reputation, not because it's real." He understood in that moment why a woman with everything on paper might still be one of the loneliest people in that building. Before he left, Elena pressed a small index card into his hand. Ava's asthma history, her medications, her pediatrician's number, written in Elena's own neat print. "Just in case," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I don't know why I trust you with this. I just do." Arthur folded it into his jacket pocket and told himself he'd probably never need it. The donor live stream from the gala hadn't stayed contained for long. It took only 48 hours for a single frame from it to break loose and spread far past the room it started in. Someone had screenshotted the moment Arthur crouched down, Ava's small hand wrapped around his wrist. Both faces caught mid-moment. It hit the company's internal group chat first. By morning, it had crossed into the private parent group at Ava's school. The caption underneath, when Arthur finally saw it, forwarded from a coworker, made his stomach turn. "Paramedic using the CEO's daughter to climb the social ladder." It didn't matter that it wasn't true. Comments piled underneath, some defending him, most not. A few went after Elena instead, questioning her judgment, her parenting, her instincts as a mother and CEO in the same breath, as though the two were the same failure. Arthur tried to go on with his week the way he always did, up at 5:10, breakfast for Miles, the dragon groaning to life in the parking lot. But 2 days after the photo spread, a text came in from a number he didn't recognize. "Keep getting close to her, and you'll lose your job at the station. Consider this a warning." He stared at it for a long moment in the cab of the ambulance before Shift-Start thumb hovering over the screen. He didn't answer it. He didn't know yet who'd sent it, but he knew the feeling settling into his chest. The old familiar feeling of a man being told, without ever being told outright, that he didn't belong somewhere. He'd felt it his whole life. He'd hoped his son wouldn't have to. Across the city, in a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, Elena stood very still, an email open on her monitor. It was from the board, formal, cold, carbon-copied to 6 names she recognized, and 1 she didn't. The subject line alone made her hand tremble around her coffee cup. "Personal conduct and company image. Explanation required by December 31st. She read it twice. Then she looked out at the frozen lake, and for the first time since she'd built this company from nothing, Elena Vaughn did not know what she was going to do next. Team Yes. Elena should risk everything and defend Arthur publicly before that deadline hits. Team No. She should protect the company first and stay quiet. Drop yes or no below and stay to see who actually called it right. New Year's Eve arrived cold and clear over Lake Michigan, and Elena's Gold Coast home filled with the same donors, board members, and practiced smiles from the Fairmont Gala a week earlier. Against her PR team's advice, she'd chosen to host rather than hide, to smile and prove nothing was wrong. Arthur wasn't invited. He hadn't expected to be. But Elena had asked him quietly 2 days before to stop by anyway, off the books, in case Ava needed a familiar face. He'd agreed for the girl's sake, and told himself he'd stay in the background. He was standing near the kitchen doorway when he heard Grant Holloway's voice carry from the hallway, pitched low, but not low enough. "That paramedic is becoming a serious media liability," Grant said to another board member, swirling a glass of something amber. "The board is not going to sit by while Elena turns this company's image into a tabloid story over a man who empties bedpans for a living." Arthur went still. He'd heard worse before. In rooms that assumed he wasn't listening, it never stopped landing somewhere. But he had no time to feel it, because that's when he heard a thin, high wheeze from the sunroom. Ava was on the floor, back against the glass wall, chest heaving, her lips taking on a color Arthur never wanted to see on a child. Asthma, compounded by panic. He still had the index card Elena had pressed into his hand days earlier, folded in his jacket pocket. He moved on instinct, 6 years of training built into his hands. At her side, in seconds, he signed calm instructions. "Breathe with me, slow," while his fingers found her pulse. He was the only person in that house who could reach her in the language she understood. Elena came running, heels forgotten, and tried to push through to her daughter. Grant caught her arm. "You can't let an outside man put his hands on her in front of donors," he said low and urgent. 2 other board members closing in behind him. "Think about what this looks like, Elena. Think about the company." "My daughter can't breathe," Elena said. And for one terrible second she hesitated, pulled between the woman who'd built an empire and the mother standing 3 feet from her own child's emergency. In that half-second, Elena wasn't choosing between a stranger and her daughter. She was choosing between the widow, who'd built an empire alone because breaking down even once might have cost her everything, and the mother who'd never once let herself break down at home. The company was the only thing she'd ever fully trusted to protect them both. And for one unforgivable second, protecting it felt safer than admitting it couldn't. Arthur got Ava's breathing leveled out on his own, the color returning to her lips, her small hand gripping his sleeve the entire time. When the paramedics, Elena finally called, arrived 11 minutes later, Ava was stable, tired, and safe. That's when Grant stepped forward and asked Arthur in front of the room to leave. Elena didn't say a word in his defense. She stood there torn open and let him walk into the cold without a glance back. Because glancing back in that room would have cost her something she wasn't ready to lose. Arthur said nothing either. He'd learned some rooms weren't worth arguing with. He walked to the Dragon, sat behind the wheel, and let the engine groan to life in the dark. He thought that was the worst part of his night. He had no idea what was coming next. Once the door shut, Elena carried Ava upstairs herself, past donors still murmuring downstairs, past Grant straightening his cuffs, like a man who'd corrected a minor scheduling error. She sat on the edge of Ava's bed long after her daughter drifted off, thumb tracing the scuffed silver bracelet, and finally let herself feel exactly how frightened she'd been. She thought about the half-second she'd hesitated at the sunroom door, and knew she'd think about it for a long time. Downstairs, the party carried on as if nothing had happened. Champagne refilled, countdown clocks synced to midnight. Elena never went back down. She sat in the dark hallway outside her daughter's room, phone in her lap, and missed the first fireworks over the lake at midnight. His radio crackled before he'd even pulled out of the driveway. Multi-vehicle incident, Lakeshore Drive northbound near Oak Street. Logistics truck overturned, requesting all available units. The dispatcher read off the company name, and Arthur's stomach dropped before his brain caught up it was Elena's company. One of her own delivery trucks on New Year's Eve flipped across 2 lanes of Lakeshore Drive with a driver trapped inside. Arthur was first on scene. Traffic backed up for a mile, lake wind cutting sideways across the road. Cardboard boxes and crates littered both lanes, the truck on its side against the median. He worked fast and clean, stabilized the driver, called for extraction, kept his voice level while a traffic officer waved oncoming headlights around the wreckage. It was while helping clear the cargo straps off the wreckage that he noticed something wrong. The heavy-duty tie-down straps hadn't snapped from stress the way they do in a real accident. They'd been cut, clean, even lines, the kind a blade makes. Arthur had seen enough real accidents in 6 years to know the difference in his sleep. He flagged down the scene's security coordinator, who'd already pulled up loading dock footage on his phone for the insurance report. Arthur pointed out the cut straps. The coordinator's face went pale, and he turned the screen toward Arthur without a word. Grant Holloway, near the loading dock, 3 hours before the truck departed. And then, almost as an afterthought, the coordinator mentioned an internal message that had been quietly circulating and just as quietly deleted, one he'd screenshotted before it vanished. Create an incident big enough to force Elena to resign before the new year. Arthur stood on the shoulder of Lakeshore Drive, near 1 a.m, lights spinning red across his face, and understood all at once this had never been about him. He was a convenient target. The real target had always been Elena. A resignation would clear the board's path for Grant to take her chair, and her daughter had nearly paid the price for it, twice in one night. He didn't sleep that night. Neither did Elena. By sunrise, the story had already found its way to the local news desks. The headline ran under a photo of the overturned truck, lake ice glittering behind it. Logistics truck accident on Lakeshore Drive, Sabotage suspected. Paramedic on scene faces renewed scrutiny. Arthur read it standing in his kitchen at 6 a.m., coffee going cold in his chipped mug. Miles still asleep down the hall. He thought about the message, warning him to stay away, about Ava's hand gripping his sleeve as she fought to breathe, about Elena's silence at the door. And underneath it all, Quiet and stubborn, that same old belief held its ground. The truth finds its way to daylight, even when everyone in the room is determined to keep it buried. What Arthur didn't know yet was that the truth was about to come out in the last place anyone expected, a boardroom in front of everyone who tried to bury it. Elena hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since the accident. She'd spent them at her kitchen table pulling every piece of footage and every message thread she could find. She didn't tell her assistant. She didn't tell legal. She built the case herself alone at 2 in the morning, the only way she knew how to survive. She hadn't been careful about where she did it. More than once, Ava had wandered in for water and caught her mother on the phone with security, the words "cut straps" and "sabotage" plain on her lips. Elena hadn't realized how much a child who couldn't hear a room had learned to read everything else in it instead. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 o'clock on January 2nd, in a conference room on the 40th floor, overlooking a lake still crusted with ice from the accident 4 nights earlier. Elena walked in already knowing how this would go. Grant had made sure of that. He didn't wait long to start. "Let's be honest about what happened here," Grant said, standing at the head of the table like he already owned it. Elena's personal distraction, this relationship with a paramedic, is what led to a lapse in judgment on New Year's Eve. That lapse is directly connected to the safety failures behind Monday night's accident. I don't think anyone wants to say it, but I will. A few board members nodded. Nobody spoke up against him. Elena sat with her hands folded on the table, jaw tight, watching years of leadership get dismantled in a single sentence. That's when the door opened. Ava, brought by the family's nanny, at Elena's own quiet request the night before, walked straight into the middle of the meeting. She didn't look at the board members. She looked at her mother. Then she began to sign. Slow, deliberate, loud in the only way a deaf child can be loud in a room full of hearing adults. By making sure every person watched her hands, the room went silent, except for the low hum of the heating vents. A secretary at the side table froze, pen still touching paper. Elena stood, her voice cracked halfway through. "She says..." Elena had to stop, swallow, start again. "She says, that man saved me with his hands. That man," she looked directly at Grant, "only talks and cuts ropes." Nobody moved. An older board member pushed his chair back and stood slowly, like something inside him had finally settled into place. Elena didn't wait for anyone else to speak. She reached into the folder she'd built alone over 3 sleepless nights and connected her laptop to the screen. The hallway footage played first. Grant's voice caught through a door he hadn't realized was ajar, calling Arthur a media liability, minutes before Ava's breathing gave out. Then the parking garage footage, time-stamped 3 hours before the truck departed. Grant near the loading dock, with no scheduling reason to be there. Then the screenshotted message meant to vanish quietly. Create an incident big enough to force Elena to resign before the new year. Every eye moved from the screen to Grant, then back, then slowly to Elena. That was when she broke. The composure she'd held since the gala, since the accident, since every quiet room where she'd swallowed her fear to protect the company's image, simply gave out. Her voice, when it came, wasn't a CEO's voice at all. It was just a mother's. "I almost lost my daughter," Elena said, "because I was too afraid of what all of you would think of me." Grant's threats had never really been the danger. The real danger was the voice in Elena's own head, whispering for weeks that a woman raising a deaf child alone had no right to also want something as reckless as being seen as cared for as human. She hadn't been protecting the company from scandal. She'd been protecting herself from ever needing anyone enough to lose them the way she'd already lost a husband. Watching Ava sign the truth in front of everyone was the first time that voice finally lost. Nobody in that boardroom had ever seen her cry. She didn't try to hide it now. Grant tried to speak once the footage stopped. Something about context, about the message being taken out of proportion. The board member who'd stood earlier cut him off cold. "You've been angling for her chair since the merger fell through 2 years ago. Everyone at this table knows it. Sit down, Grant." Nobody looked at him again. Security escorted Grant out within the hour. He didn't fight. He didn't say another word. though he glanced back once at Elena. Not with anger, but the flat, calculating look of a man already rearranging his next move. By that afternoon, legal had begun preparing to sue him over the sabotage on Lakeshore Drive and the leaked messages. Word moved fast. Within a week, two of Grant's longtime partners had quietly severed ties. The board voted unanimously to keep Elena in her position, several apologizing to her directly before filing out. But the hardest conversation of that week wasn't in the boardroom. It happened 3 days later in Arthur's own kitchen. Elena came to Wesley Avenue herself. No assistant, no car service, just her and Jeans standing on Arthur's front step in the cold, looking out of place and seeming to know it. Arthur let her in without ceremony. The apartment smelled like the grilled cheese he'd made Miles for dinner. She offered him a position, special advisor to the charitable fund. Real authority this time. Full pay, his choice of hours. Arthur said no. "I've had my name dragged through 3 different group chats in 2 weeks," he said, arms crossed, careful and tired. "I don't need a 4th round of it. I've got a son to raise. I can't keep being the story." Elena didn't argue. She'd expected the answer, and respected it too much to push. But Miles had been sitting at the kitchen table the whole time, homework spread out, listening the way 9-year-olds always listen, even when adults think they're not. After Elena left, he looked up at his father with the bluntness only a child can manage without cruelty. "Dad," he said, "if you don't take it, kids like Ava are just going to keep getting ignored." Like she was. Arthur didn't answer right away. He stood at the sink, hands braced on the counter, and thought about that December ballroom, a girl alone in a corner chair, and how many other rooms across the city probably had a version of Ava sitting quietly in them right now, unseen. He thought, too, about someone else. Someone from a long time ago who used to sit quietly in rooms exactly like that. He didn't tell Miles who he meant. He just ruffled his son's hair on the way past and told him to finish his math before bed. That night, after Miles was asleep, Arthur sat alone at the kitchen table, porch light off, Miss Betty's swing quiet next door. Turning the decision over the way he checked equipment before a shift, looking for the crack that might give out later if he wasn't paying attention now. 2 days later, Arthur called Elena back and told her he'd changed his mind, on one condition. He wouldn't do it for the cameras. He'd do it in the field training staff, not standing on stages. Elena agreed before he'd even finished the sentence. Then, quieter, almost to herself, she added one more thing. "There's something about this fund," she said, "that I've never told anyone. Not the board, not the press, not even Ava." She wasn't ready to say it yet, but it was coming. And when it did, it would change how Arthur understood every single thing that had happened since that December night at the Fairmont. January is a quiet month in Chicago, gray and slow. But that January, something in the city's opinion of Arthur Kane began to shift. Nobody ever confirmed who leaked the boardroom footage, the clip of Ava standing in the 40th floor conference room, signing while her mother translated through tears. It surfaced on a local news account, then spread further than the company expected. The comments underneath read differently now. People weren't mocking the paramedic anymore. They were asking why it had taken a deaf 8-year-old to say what the adults in that room hadn't had the courage to. Arthur didn't read most of it. He learned by then not to go looking for his name in places that weren't his kitchen or his own 2 ears. He took the advisor role on his terms. Not a title, not a stage, just his hands and his training. He spent his weeks going station to station, teaching EMS crews the basics. How to get a scared, nonverbal, or deaf patient to trust you in under 60 seconds. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the kind Arthur had always understood mattered more than the kind that got you noticed. Elena changed company policy within the month. Every major event now required a staff member fluent in American Sign Language. It cost the company almost nothing and had apparently never once occurred to anyone before. Ava changed too. She stopped waiting in corners. At the next company function, a modest ribbon cutting, nothing like the Fairmont gala, she walked straight up to guests and signed introductions herself, a staff interpreter trailing behind her. Nobody ignored her twice. Miles came along sometimes on weekends, when Arthur had training sessions and no sitter available. He picked up basic signs faster than anyone expected, wanting simply to talk to his new friend. He became, without anyone planning it, the easiest bridge between two worlds. Grant Holloway didn't fare as well. Within 2 months, most of his old business partners had quietly cut ties. The lawsuit against him moved forward that spring. Nobody at Elena's company spoke his name much anymore. And when they did, it was in the past tense, like a weather event that had passed through and left its damage behind. As for Arthur and Elena, the two of them kept a careful distance in public. No photographs, no rumors. The tabloids could hang a headline on. Whatever was quietly growing between them, neither one rushed it. They'd both learned the hard way what happened when private things got dragged into daylight too soon. But one small moment in a public park would tell Elena more than any headline ever could. Back on Wesley Avenue, life mostly went back to its old shape. Arthur still made eggs at 5:10, still fought the Dragon's engine on cold mornings, still sat out on Miss Betty's porch some evenings when the swing needed tightening again. She'd caught wind of the whole story by then, and she only had one comment about it. "Rich folks," she said, rocking slow, "spend their whole lives looking for what you've had the whole time for free." Arthur didn't argue with her. He rarely did. It happened on an ordinary Saturday in late January, at a small park 2 blocks from Elena's building, where Ava liked to feed the pigeons. Elena sat on a bench, watching her daughter scatter breadcrumbs with the seriousness only children bring to small rituals. When Ava turned back and signed something meant only for her mother, "I want Arthur to stay forever," like his sister stayed with him. Elena went very still, pigeons scattering around Ava's feet in the cold morning light. It was the first time anyone, Arthur included, had mentioned his sister to her. And something about the phrasing struck her as more than a child's simple wish. She thought about the fundraising file on her own coffee table months ago, marked up in her own handwriting, about donors who weren't genuine. She thought about the anonymous message Arthur had received, warning him away. She thought about a man who'd shown up at a gala he wasn't invited to, who knew a language that had nothing to do with his job, who'd walked away from money and title twice, rather than let his son watch him become somebody's headline. And she thought, for the first time, that maybe some of what she'd built hadn't started the way she'd always assumed it had. That evening she found Arthur waiting outside, leaning against the dragon in the cold, with his hands in his coat pockets. She didn't ease into the question. She just asked it, quiet and direct. "Your sister," Elena said. "What was her name?" Arthur looked at her for a long moment before he answered. Something in his face told her this wasn't a small question, and that the answer had been waiting a long time to be asked. What Elena didn't know yet was that the answer had been sitting in a locked file in her own office for 7 years. 1 year later, the Fairmont Chicago ballroom filled up again for the Christmas gala. The same string lights, the same view of Millennium Park glittering through tall windows. But it wasn't the same room. This year, Ava stood on stage beside her mother in a green velvet dress instead of red and signed a short thank you while an interpreter spoke the words aloud. Nobody in that ballroom needed the translation as badly as they had 12 months earlier. A dozen guests signed parts of it back to her, clumsy but sincere. There was no corner chair with a little girl sitting alone in it that night. Elena had made sure of that months ago, and it had held. Every table now had a small printed card explaining a handful of basic signs. Hello, thank you, welcome. Arthur stood near the edge of the stage, not in an agency vest this time, but in a simple dark suit. Miles stood beside him, 9, going on 10, whispering that his dad still looked ridiculous in anything but a work jacket. Arthur laughed, quiet, and didn't disagree. Arthur had told her the name back in the spring, sitting on the Dragon's tailgate outside a training site. Clara, he'd said. Her name was Clara. Elena hadn't pushed for more that day. She'd only nodded and tucked the name away. After the speeches ended and the crowd thinned toward the dessert tables, Elena found Arthur near the coat check and handed him a small wooden box, old and scuffed at the corners. I found this going through the fund's original paperwork, she said, from the year I started it. I think it belongs to you more than it belongs to me." Inside was a single bank statement, 7 years old, folded soft along its creases. One line was circled in old ink, an anonymous donation to the very first year of Elena's charitable fund. A number large enough it had caused a stir among her staff, though no one had ever learned where it came from. Arthur's hands went still around the paper. The amount matched almost to the dollar a legal settlement Clara had received years earlier, not long before the long illness tied to her hearing loss took her far too young. Arthur remembered sitting beside her at a kitchen table when the settlement papers came through, both of them unsure what a person was even supposed to do with money that couldn't buy back a single conversation they'd already lost. He'd always assumed she'd left it untouched. He'd never once thought to check. He hadn't known that his sister, quietly, in the last months of her life, had chosen to send every dollar of it somewhere else instead, somewhere it could still do good in the world, without ever telling him. Arthur had spent 7 years believing his sister's last act had been dying quietly, without complaint. He'd never imagined she'd spent her final months doing something loud, instead choosing on her own terms how her short life would keep mattering after it ended. The grief he'd carried had never really been about missing her. It had been the guilt of a big brother who thought he should have taken care of her, right up until he learned she'd been quietly taking care of strangers he hadn't even met yet. At the bottom of the statement, in handwriting Arthur hadn't seen in 7 years, but would have known anywhere, Clara had written a single line before the account was closed out. "So that no child ever has to sit alone at a grown-up's party again." Arthur stood very still, the noise of the gala fading around him, and understood all at once that every piece of this past year, that first December smile, the whispered insults, the panic in a penthouse sunroom, the truck on Lakeshore Drive, Elena breaking open in front of her own board, had been quietly leading back to this one small box. "I knew her name," Elena said softly. "I never knew it was her. Not until today." Arthur didn't say anything for a long moment. He only nodded, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, tears came unhurried and unashamed, right there near the coat check, with his son's hand finding his sleeve the same way Ava's once had. Outside the tall windows, the Christmas lights of Millennium Park reflected off the polished stone floor, right where 1 year before, a little girl had once sat by herself unseen. Nobody sits there alone anymore. This story reminds us that the quietest people in a room are usually carrying the most, and that noticing them costs nothing but the few seconds most of us have stopped bothering to spare. If there's a hard-working single father in your life, stop waiting for a birthday or holiday to tell him you see him. Call him this week and ask how he's doing, not the kids. Most single dads can tell you the last time somebody asked about their children. Almost none can remember the last time somebody asked about them. If you've lost a husband or wife and the house still goes quiet around 6 o'clock, don't just wait it out. Set the table properly anyway tonight. Real plate, real glass. Not because it fixes anything, but because treating yourself like an afterthought is a habit, same as any other. And habits are the one thing at our age we still get to choose. And if you're retired and wondering what's left worth building, remember what Arthur built, without ever calling it that. A neighbor who checked on him, a son who trusted him, a stranger's daughter who chose him, without a single spoken word. That's not luck, it's attention. So this week at the pharmacy, at church coffee hour, in the waiting room, look for the one person nobody's talking to. Sit down next to them. You don't have to fix anything. Just don't let them spend that hour the way Ava used to spend her evenings, surrounded and still alone. That's the inheritance this story is really asking you to pass down. Behind every viral, tear-jerking script is a human heart that felt pain, hope, and injustice. First, AI was merely a helpful assistant in shaping the words, so the message of empathy and courage could reach wider audiences.